gray silhouette of Hashima Island rises from the turbulent waters of the East China Sea like the fossilized remains of a colossal battleship. It sits alone in the rolling waves, roughly 9 miles from the port city of Nagasaki, Japan. Local fishermen have long whispered stories about this place, and they call it Gunkanjima, or Battleship Island, due to its imposing concrete sea walls and high-rise silhouette. The ocean crashes against the perimeter with a relentless violence that seems to want to reclaim the artificial land back into the dark depths. Mist clings to the crumbling structures and obscures the jagged skyline that was once the most densely populated place on the entire planet. Now the only residents are the screaming sea birds and the restless spirits of those who died in the darkness below the waves. This concrete labyrinth was not always a ghost town left to rot in the salt air and typhoons. In the late 19th century, coal was discovered beneath the seafloor, and the Mitsubishi Corporation bought the island in 1890 to extract the black gold. They built a city on top of a rock that was barely large enough to hold a shrine, let alone a population of thousands. They constructed massive sea walls to protect the mine shafts and the workers from the wrath of the ocean. Over the decades that followed, the island grew upward and outward as concrete apartment blocks were stacked upon one another like gray tombstones. It became a symbol of rapid Japanese industrialization, but it also became a prison of labor and suffering that few on the mainland truly understood. Beneath the towering apartments lay a network of tunnels that stretched deep under the ocean floor, where men toiled in temperatures that often exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity was suffocating, and the air was thick with coal dust that coated the lungs and blackened the skin. Miners would descend into the earth, knowing that a pocket of gas or a sudden collapse could bury them in a watery grave forever. The pressure of the ocean above them was a constant psychological weight that pressed down on their minds, just as the rock pressed down on their bodies. Accidents were common, and the records of the dead were often kept quiet to maintain the facade of industrial progress and national strength. The living conditions on the surface were hardly better than the hellish conditions below the ground. The apartments were cramped concrete cells where families lived on top of one another with zero privacy. Block 30 was built in 1916 and was the first reinforced concrete apartment building in Japan. But it was a gray and joyless monolith. The residents shared communal baths and kitchens, and the noise of daily life was inescapable. In the narrow alleyways between the buildings, sunlight struggled to reach the ground, and the air was stagnant. It was a society built on efficiency and production, where human comfort was a secondary concern to the output of the mine. During the years of World War II, the darkness of Hashima Island deepened into something truly horrific. As Japanese men were drafted into the military, the demand for coal increased, and the labor force was replenished with forced laborers from Korea and China. These prisoners of war were brought to the island against their will and forced to work in the most dangerous sections of the undersea mine. They were starved and beaten and treated as expendable machinery rather than human beings. The stairway to hell was the ominous nickname given to the long flight of concrete steps leading to the mine entrance. For many of these forced laborers, that stairway was a one-way trip into oblivion. Stories from survivors paint a picture of absolute despair, where the only escape from the torture was death itself. Some men jumped from the sea walls into the churning ocean, hoping to swim to the mainland, but the currents were treacherous, and most were swallowed by the sea. Others chose to end their lives in the dark tunnels, rather than face another day of brutal labor and starvation. Their bodies were often cremated on the island, and their ashes were scattered to the winds or mixed with the coal waste. The spiritual weight of this suffering seeped into the concrete foundations of the island, creating a reservoir of negative energy that lingers to this day. After the war ended, the forced laborers were repatriated, but the mining operations continued with renewed vigor to fuel the rebuilding of Japan. The population soared until 1959, when it reached its peak density. Over 5,000 people were crammed onto this tiny rock, creating a suffocating atmosphere of humanity. Yet despite the overcrowding, there was a strange sense of community born from shared hardship. They had schools and a hospital and a cinema and even a pachinko parlor. They lived their entire lives on this concrete slab, surrounded by the endless ocean. But beneath the surface of normalcy, the ghosts of the past were simply waiting in the shadows. The end came swiftly in 1974, when petroleum replaced coal as the primary energy source for the nation. Mitsubishi announced the closure of the mine, and the residents were given mere months to leave. The exodus was rapid and chaotic, as families packed what they could carry and left the rest behind. They left furniture and clothing and televisions and children's toys. The island was abandoned almost overnight, turning a bustling city into a silent mausoleum. The power was cut and the ships stopped coming, and Hashima Island was left to the elements. The wind began to howl through the broken windows, and the rain washed away the last traces of the living. Decades passed, and the island sat in silence as the salt air ate away at the steel reinforcements, and the concrete began to crumble. It became a forbidden place where no one was allowed to set foot. Fishermen avoided the waters around the sea walls, claiming that they could hear voices carried on the wind. Urban legends began to spread about the ghosts of the miners, who were still trapping in the tunnels below. They said that if you listened closely, you could hear the sound of pickaxes striking rock, and the low moan of men suffocating in the dark. The island became a black spot on the map and a place of fear and superstition. Decades later, an American researcher named Jonathan Reed secured rare permission to document the decay of the island for a historical preservation project. Jonathan was a man of science who did not believe in ghosts or curses. He arrived on a small chartered boat on a gray and overcast afternoon in late October. The sea was choppy, and the boat captain refused to dock for long, warning Jonathan that a storm was brewing and that he would not return until the next morning. Jonathan stepped onto the cracked concrete pier with his heavy camera gear and watched as the boat sped away toward the safety of the Nagasaki harbor. The silence of the island was absolute and heavy. It was not a peaceful silence, but a suffocating absence of sound that pressed against the eardrums. The only noise was the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the sea wall and the occasional cry of a black kite circling high above. Jonathan walked past the rusted remains of the conveyor belts that once carried coal to the transport ships. The iron was twisted and orange with corrosion, looking like the skeletal ribs of some prehistoric beast. He felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. It was a coldness that seemed to radiate from the ground itself. He made his way toward the residential district, where the apartment blocks stood like silent sentinels. The windows were dark, hollow eyes staring out at the nothingness. He entered Block 65, which was the largest apartment building on the island. The air inside was stagnant and smelled of mold and wet concrete. He walked down the long corridors where the doors to the apartments hung open on rusted hinges. Inside the rooms, he saw the remnants of lives interrupted. A dust-covered television set sat in the corner of a tatami room, and a calendar from 1974 hung on the peeling wall. Jonathan set up his tripod to photograph a child's tricycle that had been left in the middle of a hallway. The red paint was chipped and faded, but the object looked startlingly out of place in the gray ruin. As he looked through the viewfinder, he saw movement in the shadows at the far end of the corridor. He lowered the camera and squinted into the gloom, but there was nothing there. He told himself it was just a trick of the light or a rat scurrying across the debris. But the feeling of being watched intensified. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and his heart began to beat a little faster. He continued his exploration, moving deeper into the complex of buildings. He found a classroom in the island school, where textbooks still lay on the desks, rotting away in the humidity. The chalkboard had faint writing on it that was barely legible after 40 years. It looked like a lesson plan for a mathematics class. Jonathan felt a sudden wave of sadness wash over him. It was an overwhelming emotion that did not feel like his own. It was a heavy, crushing despair that made it hard to breathe. He gripped the edge of a desk to steady himself and gasped for air. The light outside began to fade as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the storm the captain had warned about began to roll in. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind picked up howling through the broken windows like a chorus of screaming voices. Jonathan knew he needed to find a secure place to set up his camp for the night. He chose a room on the second floor of the hospital building, thinking it would be safer than the high-rise apartments. He cleared away the debris and unrolled his sleeping bag, trying to ignore the deep shadows that gathered in the corners of the room. As night fell, the island transformed. The gray concrete turned black, and the sound of the ocean became a roar. Jonathan lit a small lantern and sat in the circle of light, trying to review his notes. But he could not concentrate. He heard footsteps in the hallway outside. They were heavy, dragging footsteps, like someone wearing heavy boots. He froze and listened. The sound stopped just outside the door to his room. He called out, asking if anyone was there, but his voice sounded thin and weak in the vast emptiness. There was no answer. He stood up and walked to the door, shining his flashlight into the corridor. The beam of light cut through the dust motes, but revealed nothing. The hallway was empty. He turned back to his room and felt a cold breath against his ear. It was unmistakably the feeling of someone exhaling right next to him. He spun around, swinging the flashlight wildly, but he was alone. Panic began to rise in his chest. He realized that being alone on this island was a terrible mistake. The stories of the fishermen were not just superstitions. Jonathan decided to barricade the door. He dragged an old metal bed frame across the entrance and piled rotting chairs against it. He retreated to the corner of the room and sat with his back against the wall, holding the flashlight like a weapon. The wind outside screamed louder, and the rain began to lash against the building. Above the storm, he heard a new sound. It was a low, rhythmic thumping coming from beneath the floor. It sounded like machinery starting up deep underground. Thump, thump, thump. The sound vibrated through the concrete and into his bones. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the storm was causing loose debris to bang against the structure, but the rhythm was too precise. It sounded like a heartbeat or a pickaxe. He closed his eyes and tried to block it out, but then the voices started. At first, it was just a murmur indistinguishable from the wind, but then words began to form. They were not in English. It sounded like a mix of Japanese and Korean. Angry voices, pleading voices, voices crying out in pain. The chorus of the dead was rising from the mines. Suddenly, the lantern flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Jonathan fumbled for his backup batteries, but his hands were shaking so badly, he dropped them. He was left in the pitch black, with only the sounds of the storm and the voices. Then a pale blue light began to manifest in the center of the room. It was not a light source, he recognized. It swirled like smoke and slowly coalesced into the shape of a man. The figure was translucent and covered in black dust. He wore ragged clothes and a miner's helmet. The apparition did not look at Jonathan. It stood facing the wall, its shoulders slumped in exhaustion. Then another figure appeared next to it, and another. Soon the room was crowded with the spectral forms of miners. They were gaunt and skeletal with hollow eyes that stared into an abyss only they could see. The temperature in the room dropped to freezing, and Jonathan could see his own breath misting in the air. He pressed himself harder against the wall, wishing he could disappear into the concrete. One of the figures turned its head slowly. Its neck cracked with a sound like snapping dry wood. It looked directly at Jonathan. The face was a mask of agony. The eyes were gone, replaced by pools of black darkness. The ghost opened its mouth, and a stream of black water poured out, splashing silently onto the floor. Jonathan wanted to scream, but his throat was paralyzed. The figure took a step toward him, then another. The other spirits began to turn as well, their attention focusing on the intruder. Jonathan scrambled to his feet, knocking over the lantern. He grabbed his backpack and threw himself at the barricade. He shoved the heavy furniture aside with a strength born of pure terror and burst into the hallway. He ran blindly down the corridor, his flashlight beam bouncing frantically off the peeling walls. He could hear the dragging footsteps behind him. There were dozens of them now, a stampede of the dead, chasing him through the ruins. He did not look back. He reached the stairwell and took the steps 3 at a time, risking a broken neck in the darkness. He burst out of the hospital entrance and into the raging storm. The rain hit him like icy bullets, and the wind threatened to knock him off his feet. He ran toward the pier, hoping against hope that the boat might have returned early, or that there was some place to hide. But the pier was empty, and the waves were crashing over the concrete, washing away any hope of escape. He sought shelter in the small Shinto shrine near the top of the hill. The wooden structure was rotting, and the roof was partially collapsed, but it was holy ground. He collapsed onto the wet floor, gasping for air. He looked out over the island from his vantage point. Lightning flashed, illuminating the entire city. In that brief flash of light, he saw them. Thousands of figures stood on the rooftops and in the courtyards and on the sea walls. They were all looking up at the shrine. They were all looking at him. The ground beneath the shrine began to tremble. It was not an earthquake. It was the mine shafts collapsing deep below. The sound was a deafening roar that drowned out the storm. Jonathan felt the earth shifting, and he knew that the island was angry. It did not want visitors. It wanted to be left alone with its dead. He curled into a ball and covered his head, praying to a god he had not spoken to in years. He promised that if he survived, he would never return to this cursed place. The night passed in a blur of terror and hallucinations. He saw faces in the wood grain and heard whispers in the rain. He felt cold hands touching his face and grabbing his ankles. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the black eyes of the miner staring at him. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind unable to process the sheer volume of fear. He was an intruder in a necropolis, and the residents were making their displeasure known. When dawn broke the storm had passed. The sky was a pale gray, and the sea was calm. Jonathan woke up stiff and freezing. He was alone in the shrine. The army of ghosts had vanished with the darkness. He stood up on shaky legs and looked out at the island. It looked exactly as it had when he arrived. Silent, gray, dead, but now he knew the truth. He knew that the silence was a lie. He grabbed his gear and stumbled down the hill toward the pier. The boat arrived 2 hours later. The captain looked at Jonathan with concern, noting his pale skin and the haunted look in his eyes. Jonathan did not speak. He boarded the boat and sat in the stern, staring back at the island as they pulled away. He watched the gray silhouette shrink against the horizon. He saw the dark windows of the apartments watching him go. He could still feel the coldness in his bones, a chill that the morning sun could not thaw. As the boat moved further away, Jonathan raised his camera to take one last photo. He zoomed in on the seawall near the mine entrance. Through the telephoto lens, he saw a figure standing on the edge of the concrete. It was a small child holding a red tricycle. The child waved slowly. Jonathan lowered the camera, and the figure was gone. He took the memory card out of the camera and threw it into the ocean, watching it sink beneath the waves. Back on the mainland, Jonathan tried to return to his normal life, but Hashima Island had left a mark on him. He developed a chronic cough that the doctors could not explain. His lungs were clear on the X-rays, but he could taste coal dust in the back of his throat. He woke up screaming in the middle of the night, dreaming of dark tunnels and rising water. He could never stand to be in a room with the lights off ever again. He wrote his report, but he left out the ghosts. He wrote about the architecture and the history and the industrial decline. He wrote about the facts because the truth was too terrifying to be believed. But he knew that the island was still there waiting. He knew that the spirits were still trapped in the concrete and the rock. They were waiting for the next visitor, waiting for someone to share their darkness. Hashima Island remains a popular tourist destination today, though visitors are restricted to a small walkway and are never allowed to enter the buildings. Tour guides tell the history of the coal and the modernization of Japan. They gloss over the suffering and the death. They do not talk about the forced labor or the suicides. They do not mention the voices that can be heard when the wind blows from the north. They sell the image of a ruin, not the reality of a graveyard. But the ghosts do not care about the tour guides or the history books. They only care about the darkness. They are bound to the rock by pain and sorrow and unfinished business. They pace the corridors of Block 65, and they sit in the crumbling cinema, They descend the stairway to hell every night to work in the phantom mines. They are the eternal residents of Battleship Island, and they will never leave. If you ever find yourself on a boat off the coast of Nagasaki, looking at the gray silhouette on the horizon, remember this warning. Do not look too closely at the windows. Do not listen too closely to the wind. And never ever step off the path. The island is hungry, and it is always looking for new souls to join the ranks of the coal miners in the deep dark below. The silence of Hashima is not peace. It is a held breath waiting to scream.